Hello and welcome to Ways to Change the World. I'm Krishnan, guru-murthy, and this is the podcast in which we talk to extraordinary people about the big ideas in their lives and the events that have helped shape them. My guest this week is the Professor of the History and Memory of Slavery at the University of Bristol. She was, in fact, the first black woman to be appointed as a Professor of History at a British university, and that was pretty recently. Olivette Otele is the perfect guest for us to record during Black History Month. Thank you for joining us. Now, you've written a book called African Europeans, An Untold History. And one of the chapters is called Claiming a Past, Navigating the Present. And I'm guessing that's the reason you wrote this.
Yes, it's one of the many reasons I wrote this. It was really about trying to find tools for us to look into issues that are controversial, issues that makes us uncomfortable, not just me, but everybody, and see how we can come up with solutions together. And when these issues are related to colonial past, to the question of race or discrimination, I wanted to offer some hope, saying that many people have been working on these questions for many, many years, decades, even centuries. So we're not alone in this, and we can actually find solutions together. Yeah.
So why do you think learning about black people in Europe hundreds of years ago helps us navigate what's happened to George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Jacob Blake and all the protests that have erupted from that over the last few months?
Well, it's about the way Black people are perceived in certain settings, in what is called the global north. So it's about understanding that these people have their place in society. It's also about understanding that these deaths are not just random. They the result of perceptions, the result of representation as well, and a long history of policing Black bodies in Europe, but also in the Americas. So for me, it was very important to connect past and present because they are completely intertwined.
And where racism comes from?
Racism is one of the legacies of the past, the colonial past. It's about the classification that started a very long time ago, centuries ago, about the place of human beings on this planet, about who's valued, who's not valued. And even the notion of value is linked to kind of the usefulness of certain people over others. So in certain settings, I'm thinking about in Europe, for example, it's about when you're Black, you have to bring something to the table. Otherwise, you're not particularly valued. You're supposedly, you're using the system, you're abusing the system. Whereas, these expectations are not necessarily what, apply to other community groups. So yes, the racism is the legacy of the past.
I mean, you explore that question of exceptionalism in the book. And, in introducing you, I say you're the first Black professor of history. I mean, you are exceptional in yourself. You experience this classification in your own life, I suppose.
Yes. I mean, it's something I've had applied to me all my life, and applied to me because I grew up in very white environments. So for many of them, a Black person could not actually reach certain heights and could not understand certain things. And I did. And therefore, for these people, and actually the book is also an answer to these people. And for these people, I was the exceptional one. They didn't know anything about the Black community, Black communities, because there are several communities. And yet they decided that I was the exceptional one. And it always made me feel uncomfortable. I don't take it as a compliment. I just see it as, in good days, I would say crass ignorance. In other days, I see it as something utterly despicable because, you're putting your history reflection of what you think the history of this country, is about, and then applying it to the place of Black people in that history, that long history. In other words, it was just difficult for me, difficult to understand as a child to start with. I didn't understand any of it. And then as a teenager, it made me angry. And as a grown-up, I wanted to do something about it.
Is the history of exceptional Black Europeans Black people who fitted in?
Yes, I know. They've fitted in by navigating certain norms and by understanding certain norms and by using certain norms. But for some of the cases that I use in the book, it wasn't that much about fitting in. It was about children being educated and raised in white environments, and therefore they didn't know better. But at the same time, there's always this thing missing, even when you fit in. I'm an example of that, but these people, we don't have records about what they thought about their place in these societies. So we only have one side of the story.
Because it's white history. It's history written by white people.
Yes, up to this point, it's been like that, and you can't really blame people for writing a history that is based on their background and their perspective. What is detrimental for me is not accepting that it is time to shift the gaze and in multicultural Europe to actually start looking at various perspectives in history writing.
So where did you set out? And how did you set out trying to find the black Europeans who were not exceptional? If the only people who've written history to date are white people who would notice the exceptional black people.
It was a difficult task, but I wanted to start from a place where a place that many see as the birth of civilization, ancient Rome and Greece and all that. And I wanted to use that, actually, those conceptions and those preconceptions as well, to show that ancient Rome was much more diverse in thinking than we are today. And therefore, there were a circulation of people across the Mediterranean, and these people came from various backgrounds. It was hard to find documents of, everyday people, obviously, but we can also guess from the lives of these exceptional, Septimus Severus, for example, the Roman emperor. We can guess that it was about conquest, and therefore it was about engaging several populations into the Roman army and the Roman Empire. So there's nothing exceptional about this. It was quite common, and therefore these people were varied from Egypt, the Thebes, to Britannia.
But how do you start to form what racism is, where racism comes from these early histories?
Well, that's the advantages of looking at the long history. You see the differences, you see the changes across time. And you realize that those changes started to really, really happen with the colonial trade, colonial exploration. You already in the 14th century, 15th century, you already have, ideas about differences between human beings. If you go even further back in time, you will see that European being little by little getting rid of the Moors, for example, North Africans, started to consider that religion was the evil, not so much the color, but religion was the horrible thing. So devaluation was through religion. So, it depended on several things and several factors. By the time you reach the 18th century, it's completely the color.
So is the thread that runs through it all othering, that they are different? Whether it's that they are black or Moors or Muslims or whatever it might be, they are different to us, the white Judeo-Christian majority.
Yeah, there's that, but there's also a point of commonalities. When you talk about class, the idea of commonalities, something like the Chevalier de Saint-Georges, 18th century dual heritage nobleman was not treated the same as the other enslaved people at the same period. So there's this idea of class too that comes into shaping our understanding of the world at the time.
You also wrote about Alessandro de Medici, the first Medici Duke of Florence. Again, when you look at what is written about him, how reliable can it be? Or the images of him that are all very fair. He doesn't look very black in the way he's portrayed. Is that a sort of a rewriting of history at the time?
Yes, it is, because the early portrait, actually, he looks dual heritage, he looks mixed. He is of a darker skin. And what is interesting is how the portrait themselves change over time. He became whiter and whiter, and the question of origins, his mother's origins, came back, and you have people contesting the fact that his mother was was black, and they were basing these stories on the paintings that were produced after. So yeah, there are mechanisms, and the very fact that this happened amuses me a bit, because it seemed to have been painful for many people to consider that the first Duke of Florence could have been black. I mean, to go to that extent, it means something. It tells you something about questions of identity and power. Who should have power? Whoever has power shouldn't be black, basically. And when it happens, you try to change the story, the narrative of the past. Yes, it's fascinating.
So what do you think is the power of changing these narratives in the modern setting?
I think it's very powerful at so many levels. It's about histories that have been put aside for certain reasons. And I believe in the power of showing everything, the ugly, the uncomfortable, and then, trusting people to make up their mind about what they want to kind of make of it. I don't believe in the fact that we should censor history, as uncomfortable as it is. So it's powerful. It's a tool for, as I see it, and I keep saying it in the book, it's a tool for liberation, not just black liberation, for everyone's liberation. Yeah.
Well, that's what I was going to say. I mean, do you think it's who it empowers, isn't it? Does it primarily empower young black people who read this and think, the world is different to how I was brought up?
Yeah, I want it to be a tool for them to understand that they're more than a history of enslavement. They're more than a history of discrimination. Their history is very long, just like any other history. It's very long, and that alone does not define them as human being in the grand scheme of human evolution and human lives. There's more, much more.
Because of course, we all know that, but in terms of the history that we've had to go back to, primarily it's been in other places, in Africa and Asia and anywhere that isn't white, to look at the history of those countries and say this is our history. But what's so powerful about this is you're saying there is another history in Europe that is not just about slavery.
Well, what is powerful is the fact that we have a common history. We have a history that is also singular. You can look at African history as just a history of Africa, and we do the same for European history. But there are stories where you have crossroads, where you have commonalities, and those commonalities are sometimes painful, but they're part of a long history. And I think, it's about knowing us as human beings. You're valued. You are part of human species. It's very hard to say this, but and I'm going to say it from a very personal point of view. I consider this earth mine. So wherever I go, I actually basically feel this is my place to be. So, and I've come to realize over the last, I'm 50, so over the last, let's say 40 years, because I've always been like that because of the education I had. Not many people think that way. They don't, they go to places and they think, oh, this is not my place to be. Well, no, yeah, it is. This is your earth.
Well, I mean, let's explore that a little bit, because you were born in Cameroon but grew up in Paris.
Yes.
And now are here. So where does your sense of belonging rest?
It came from my grandmother. It sounds like a fable, but this was a woman who was who didn't have money, who left a husband who was wealthy and abusive, and who managed to get her children, her 4 daughters, an education. She managed to get them back, and she gave them an education with very little means, but encouraged education, and who's always talked to us, her grandchildren, as powerful engines on this earth. She considered everybody valuable, important, and worthy of anything. And, from a very young age, I never had kind of the imposter syndrome, because these are the values she gave me. And it's not they weren't based on money. They were really based on the power that I have on this earth as a human being.
And so, I mean, you say you've always felt this sense of this world is yours, and you didn't have imposter syndrome. But you didn't know all of this stuff when you were younger. This is your life's work. So how did you come to this being what you wanted to focus on?
You say I didn't know it, but I did actually. I remember I was about 13, being in class and answering questions to one of the teachers, and her saying to me, you seem very confident. It's a bit arrogant to think that way, because I've answered something that I read before actually. And she was puzzled, and it's only when I gave her the reference that she was able to say, "Ah, yes." But me saying it didn't have any value. So from then on, I started thinking, so even if I share this point of view as a child, my viewpoint is not really valued. But okay, and even around my friends, I remember quite early as well, in my teens years, they always chose me as the like a prefect in the classroom. And I always wonder, why do you bother? I'm sitting at the back of the class and I'm not particularly vocal about anything. I just answer the question, but you think that I should represent you. I didn't really question that. I just find it annoying. But it's a role I took on. And over the years, as I grew up, I realized that many of them were relying on me to do stuff, because they felt that I was confident enough to take things into my hand and talk to the teachers, things like that. It's just, as you grow up, you realize that not everyone feels that way.
And when you look at the generation of students who you're teaching, do you see a confidence or a lack of confidence?
I'm very proud of this generation. They are both. They are both. Some of them are confident that if they make their demands, something will come out of it, and they need the numbers. So the protest, in Bristol, the whole Coulson statue demands about the change of the curriculum. But there's also another point that I found quite worrying, which is the confidence in them as individuals that is worrying me more. As a group, they think they're confident, they can achieve almost anything. As individuals, it's another story, because if I look at the young Black women I've been in touch with, but not just Black women, but I'm going to talk about the Black women in this case. They a lot of them, even when they're PhD students, scientists, they have this syndrome about whatever they're achieving is not really them. That famous imposter syndrome that I've been struggling with. So it's been a journey for me to try and understand how crippling that can be. So it's not just about racism preventing you from doing things, it's yourself cutting yourself from opportunities because you think, no, I can't do it, or when I'm offered the opportunity, it must be an accident. I don't deserve it.
Do you think imposter syndrome is something that is taught in a way, that we learn culturally because people talk about it so much now? Even very successful people talk about having imposter syndrome. And it's almost something that seems that is the right way to feel, that you shouldn't embrace your success, because to say I deserve my success is in some way arrogant.
I think it's something that is learned, definitely. And I also think that when you're too happy about the success, it becomes something, people see it as dangerous, and therefore you will hear about arrogance. It's not even humble, but you're expected to tone it down. And I don't understand it. I think, you celebrate your success and you learn from your mistakes. This is how the world works. And I don't see, and actually celebrating your success shows you that you can achieve so much more than, maybe you thought.
You mentioned the Colston statue, and we should talk about it. How did you feel about it at the time, and has it changed?
I find it really an interesting thing, because I did my PhD on Bristol. So for me, and it was, nearly 20 years ago. So for me to see this, how the conversation has evolved, it's fascinating. It's about Colston, but it's not just about Colston. It's about how cities in the UK and across the world actually are dealing with their colonial past, and what in the urban landscape has people focalized on that story or on that part. In other words, how the urban landscape is used to tell a story or not to tell a story in Colston's case. When I saw the statue come down, I thought, this is interesting. This is absolutely fascinating, because the conversation stalled for many, many decades. So, the young generation I talked about decided to just do it, take the matter into their own hands, completely ignoring our call for more dialogue, more conversation. Just say, no, we don't want to. So this is it. So how do we deal with it has become another topic for me to look at, because it's about politics, the politics of memory, but the politics, because it became a international actually story. But at the national level, it becomes about the law. I heard the Home Secretary talk about the law, how it should be respected. I heard about people talking about what's next. Are we going to erase history? Which is interesting. It's a false argument for me, but never mind that. I heard people saying, yes, but if you start doing that, then there's not a democratic process here. All these arguments have, they're valid in their own ways. But for me, it's really about people's understanding of what history is. Young people understand that this has no place in our society, 21st century. And therefore, they decide to do it. And even the resistance are about how do you make a collective memory? How do we form a collective memory of the event? So let's say in 20 years' time, you will have a conversation about why was he removed and why this. For me, this is not the conversation. For me, the conversation is, what is it in that act that profoundly disturb British society in its consciousness, in its history, in its sense of identity and self and place in the world? This for me is the conversation. And why is it, the second part of the conversation, why is it that this becomes the story when some of the legacies of the past are about inequality and we're not talking about it? So those silences are much more interesting and important for me, actually.
Do you think the fact that so many of that crowd were white is what discomforted so many people?
Yes, they didn't expect that. There's this narrative of young Black people smashing things, and it would have suited many people to see Black people do that in a way, because it's almost expected.
Because that's what's been projected since, isn't it, really, that this is part of the Black Lives Matter movement, smashing statues, as if it's what Black people have been demanding, when clearly it wasn't.
No, clearly it wasn't. And actually, if you see what and who is a part of Black Lives Matter, you will see a diversity of faces. It's not just Black people, or brown people. It's very diverse, and particularly in the UK, I have to say. And if you go to Germany, you'll see the same thing. It's diverse. So, it would have been comforting, because it's comforting to hang on to one's stereotypes. It's comforting because that's what you know, and therefore it allows you to say, oh, this is my place is here and their place is there. And when you're mixing several worlds together, some people at least become uncomfortable, because they have a sense that they're losing their place. That place of not necessarily economic privilege, but that place of they matter. And the rest, the Black and brown, are just the newcomers.
So on a simple level, you were pleased it happened?
Yeah, I was pleased, because I wish I had that freedom to just go and do this. As a grown-up, I can't do that. They're grown-ups, but they're also young people. So it also showed me that even I had sets of expectations, and those expectations were measured, a dialogue. Even if it's going to take another 20 years, let's just keep on talking about it. Well, these young people show that there's another way. It's not the way I would have chosen, but there's another way. And let's also remember that we're not talking about a statue of, to use European imagery, it's not Virgin Mary who was smashed. Okay, we're talking about a slave trader.
But was the other way mob rule? And is that what is really alarming about what happened?
I'm not quite sure how to answer this.
Because what if it was a crowd of people with, profoundly disturbing racist views, seeking to do something else and saying, yes, there's another way to do this, and we don't have to obey the law either?
I think it would have been equally disturbing. It would have been equally, I would have stopped and pondered as well. Because I still, deep down, I still hang into the hope that we can talk about it. We can find other ways. And in fact, I think the compromise now that it happened is to put it in a museum and to have, that story being, told and taught, but also that story of protest being told and taught as well. So there are layers of history there that we need to unpack. And maybe, in our lifetime, we can't really understand all the ramifications.
So let's just briefly go back to why the erasing history allegation is a false argument.
There are many stories and many histories that are not represented in urban landscape, and we still know about them. So the idea that because you remove a statue, you don't know the history is not necessarily true. It's equally true that if you remove the relics of something like we've seen with the Chevalier de Saint-Georges, you can destroy a history. But that particular history about, colonial administrators or colonial heroes, if you would, will never be erased because we have archives, lots of them. They kept their accounts neat for us. So I don't see how these histories could be raised. So that's why I'm saying this is not a valid argument for me. And I have to say that it's not true for all histories, but for that particular history. The other thing is histories are made. History is fluid. There are new stories that have been born out of this act. So these stories are also important. I said the history of protest, that is very in keeping of the history of protest in Bristol. It's a very local history, but it's an incredible history as well. At a national level, it's a history that needs to be taught because we are at a moment where the Black Lives Matter is has gone global. And it tells us something about the needs of our societies and the rebellion of certain categories of people. And that history is not being looked at. It's being looked at as an inconvenience rather than it's telling us something. It's shouting even about some things that need to be addressed, and we're still not doing it.
Well, what do we need to do?
Look at what needs changed. And what needs changing is discrimination. Legacies of the past, discrimination, social, racial discrimination. The fact that part of the history of Britain are not taught in schools. Why? Why are we still afraid of this? It's history. It happened. We cannot change that. Let's just teach it. But also teach the legacies as well. And that is, I think, the most uncomfortable because the legacies are not pretty. Some are about exclusion and underprivileged and about utter poverty. And this is the most uncomfortable conversation because after the conversation, you need to act and make it better. So my guess is that that's going to be a longer conversation and it's been delayed by the focus on statues.
Why do you think we are not teaching our children the history of black people or of brown people in schools? Is it because it means cutting out some of the history of white people?
No, of course not. It doesn't mean that at all. It just means that history is, I always see history as political. So it's about national narratives. And I'm saying this because I'm looking at the long history and at a kind of global, but also mostly European history. We as nations have made a narrative that is based on ideology and how we see ourselves in the world. So history is made. It's it's a very well-crafted narrative that is taught in curriculum. So it's about shifting that and changing that narrative to include others. And there's resistance to this because it means that it's not a pretty history. It's not a history of victory only. It's not a history only of achievement, advancement, and technological revolution. It's also the cost of that technology and that advancement. And the cost is subjugation of other human beings. And we're not comfortable. I mean, the majority group and the country as a whole is not comfortable with this. But, you don't only have to add the uncomfortable. There are many things that you add. You add a society that is diverse and that has multiple histories within the history. And for me, that's a wealth. That's fantastic.
And how open-minded or how closed off is university level education? I mean, you're very much the minority, aren't you?
Yes, well, I'm talking about as a historian as well. And historians traditionally have been seen as the Cerberus or the guardian, if you would. I don't know, is the term Cerberus in English? The Cerber. The guardians of hell, of hell. So historians are those guardians who hang on to the past and what it should be and what should be transmitted and all that. So it's a very conservative, traditional discipline, and it's about changing the way we do history. It has the ability to open doors. But the question is, who teaches it? It doesn't mean that all the people who teach colonial history are racist, but it definitely means that not including Black and brown people tells you something about society's resistance to have those keys to the discipline given to certain categories of people. And that, again, is interesting to a study, but it's a bit time to just do it. Because otherwise we will never have these uncomfortable stories and vibrant stories coming into the curriculum. It is time.
So how do you feel as an African European about Brexit?
I was one of those people who went knocking on doors, being spat at, pushed around, and saying Brexit is going to destroy this country. I was one of those people saying that don't do it, don't vote for it, don't, because as a European, I was able to travel across Europe. In France, you're taught that Europe is part of your identity, as a project, but also as a geographic area where you can go wherever you want as a European. But once the vote happened, I also thought that this was a democratic process. Yes, some people are saying, they lied or they did this and that, but people also voted thinking that it will bring the country together. I live in Wales. I'm based in Wales. And in Wales, many voted because they thought that this will force Westminster to look at Wales as really part of the country, not as just some kind of random province. I actually talked to people who were thinking that way. And they were saying, other people were saying, we're poor anyway, so I don't see what the European Union has brought specifically to us. Many narratives and reasons why they voted. But what I found incredibly sad is that some of the debate was not about the economic benefits, was not about the social, cultural benefits. The debate was politics. It was about a vision of Britain that is, for me, reductive. Britain alone in the world. The thing is, Britain has never been alone in the world. Britain became Britain and the British Empire because of the empire. So never alone in the world. And that story was not necessary. We go back to that story not being taught properly.
And now it's happening. Do you think it's as terrible as you thought?
I think it's terrible, but people voted. I see it around me. I worry, for example, I put my feelings of, yes, the Remain lost and all that. I'm not interested. I don't actually care of whether we lost or win. What I see is more homeless. What I see is economic hardship. And I don't see how it's going to get better without any help from anything. Just down the road from where I live, some of the centers have been funded by the European Union. Center for single mothers, centers for underage with addiction, all these stuff, and cultural centers as well. They're closing. And I worry about that. I worry about, ordinary people not having anywhere else to go. So it's not a celebration of, it's going to get worse. I actually worry, and I don't want it to get worse. So
to come back to where we started, really, which was this reaction that Britain has had, the whole world has had, to this summer of protest and the police killings in America and the events that have happened in this country as well, that provoked protest. How do you feel about it now? I mean, do you feel that this is one of those things, it's one of those eruptions that happens and goes away and everybody moves on? Or do you think it is creating lasting change?
I know many people share the idea that, some of the allies or so-called allies are moving away from it and all that. No, I think this is a crucial moment, and it's going to have lasting changes. And I say that because I look at students. For them, this is going to be a moment they will remember. Not just remember, but some of these moments have shaped their way of seeing the world. I talk to them. And even if in 5 years' time they're not at uni anymore and they moved on, this is not something they will forget because they were actively involved in this. And this shaped their way of looking at different communities, looking at social equality. And yeah, I believe that this is going to last. I might be wrong. We'll see in 10 years' time.
Is this then 1968?
68 was an interesting parallel, but it was a very bourgeois kind of movement in many ways, at least in Paris. A bourgeois movement that did not necessarily include black and brown people that much. So, no.
I mean, people have said this is a bourgeois movement as well, haven't they? This is a middle class intelligentsia uprising rather than a popular one, and that actually at a popular level you're seeing a backlash. And you're seeing the likes of Lawrence Fox and his new party and all this kind of thing. And that's where people are also gravitating as a result of this summer.
Some truth to it in the fact that the middle class was involved, but you also have to remember that black and brown grassroots organizations have been fighting for this for decades. So it's also their movement. It's also their voice finally being kind of integrated, or rather being heard by the middle class. So you can see it that way. So I don't see it as a bourgeois movement only. But what I want to say is, in relation to ethnicity, May 68 was not necessarily it wasn't really about, although there were strands, it wasn't necessarily about black and brown people. Black Lives Matter, there's a name to it. The backlash was inevitable. People seem surprised, yes, but the backlash happened. We should tone it down, or this is why, this is not working. Listen, it was bound to happen. Every protest or social movement is not going to go smoothly, and you won't have everybody buying into it.
If you could change the world by waving a magic wand or writing a page of history, how would you do it?
Oh my word, that would be amazing, but it's such a responsibility. Anyway, so I would start with the climate change and the way we look at technological advancement and what is seen as wealth building industries. So it would be about our planet and how we leave, what we leave to our children, grandchildren, etc. So that would be one aspect. The other aspect will, of course, be inequalities, social inequalities, and how we look at people with less money. The hierarchy in society is damaging at so many levels. And I will also look at history, of course. What do we do now? How do we move forward? I would teach the whole of the history. No silences, no erasure, and then encourage people to think about ourselves as this is it. This is our planet. How do you live with somebody you don't even like, or who doesn't look like you? You can still do that. You don't need to like somebody to live with them and respect them.
Olivette Otele, thank you very much indeed. Thank you for sharing your ways to change the world. You can watch all of these interviews on the Channel 4 News YouTube channel. Please do give us a rating and a review if you enjoy them. Our producer is Rachel Evans. Until next time, bye-bye.